friends, it's Erin, and I am finally here to do a wrap up with you. This is everything that I read between like the 3rd day of November and 2 days ago. So this is my motley pile. You'll notice that it's kind of small. In the 6 weeks that this wrap up contains, I read 7 books. November was definitely the month where I read the least, but I was also working on final papers, and probably, like, if you looked at the number of words that I actually did read, it's probably about the same, but a lot of my reading was articles or pieces of books and things like that that I did not count on Goodreads because they're academic articles. So someday I'll find a way to like actually track all of my reading, but that's too much work right now. Actually, if you kind of look at this pile, it's like by far the lowest reading month November was, because one of the books in this pile I had to read for school, and one of the books in this pile I finished, but it was a volume of poetry and I only had 3 poems left to read. So anyway, here we go. The first thing I finished was The Grace of Enough by Haley Stewart. This is a nonfiction book about pursuing less and living more in a throwaway culture. Haley Stewart is Catholic, and so she takes a very distinctly Catholic approach, but I think it's one that is really valuable. Just thinking about, do you have enough? Probably. She talks about forming community, and I found this really challenging and valuable. I already live in a small apartment, so it's not like I have a ton of stuff, but there are definitely things that I could change in my own life, and I really appreciated having this. I gave it 5 stars. The next thing I read was this. This is St. Paul, The Foundation of Universalism by Alain Badiou. Badiou is actually a French philosopher, a contemporary one. He's still alive and writing things right now. And Badiou's thesis is kind of this idea that St. Paul was doing this radical new thing and founding this kind of philosophic ideal of universalism with his statements like that everybody, you know, all are one in Christ Jesus, and he's focusing on an event instead of an idea, and that's a really radical break from the philosophies of the past. It was an interesting book and an interesting thesis. The problem I have with it is that his historiography actually isn't very good, and he seems to be either conveniently ignoring things or just doesn't know a lot of the contemporary scholarship that's been done about St. Paul, like historically. And so even with my like very cursory curious, like, is that actually how it is? The answer was no. So, and I'm talking like, again, historically, not theologically. So he seems to be kind of using St. Paul as an example to say what he wants to say, and it's maybe not the best example. I wasn't like super thrilled. I did not rate this. I had to read it for school. It was fine. This is the book of poems that I read 3 of, actually. This is George Herbert's 100 poems. All of the poems are from his collection called The Temple, but there's like 160 poems in that cycle. I could not find like a good reader's copy of The Temple just generally, which is actually what I wanted, so this was the closest thing I could find. I did really enjoy having the poetry. George Herbert was a Anglican priest in the 1600s, and he wrote really beautiful devotional poetry. I think that's really honest, and I think just like as a poet, he's fantastic. And then you can kind of, if you want to, read the poems devotionally, and they're definitely full of truth and beauty and goodness. My favorite is Love 3, which is the last poem, and you should just go look it up. It's called Love 3 because there are 3 poems called Love in the temple sequence. I gave that 5 stars. The next thing I finished, I actually started and finished in the same month, and that's a reread of Richard III. I read this for the first time last summer, not like in 2017, and I really enjoyed it, and I decided that one of my paper assignments, this book would work well for it, and I prefer to talk about something that's in my wheelhouse rather than something that's contemporary American and not in my academic wheelhouse. I study early modern literature like this and like George Herbert. So anyway, I reread this. It is a thoroughly enjoyable play, very interesting. One of Shakespeare's earlier works, yet so like a little uneven, but still really, really interesting. It's very long. There are a lot of words in this play, but good ones. It starts with Richard at this moment. He's the Duke of Gloucester, and his brother is King of England, and he's kind of like, I think I should be king, and so I'm gonna make it happen. And then he proceeds to make it happen. And so the story is kind of about Richard and how he like murders his way to the throne and then gets killed by Henry Richmond, who becomes Henry VII. Hello, history. So sorry that was a spoiler, but also it's history, so sorry. Kind of a tragedy. Richard is one of those villains that you kind of like to hate. He's very open about his villainy to the audience. And so that's kind of fun. And also everybody else hates Richard, and they use the Shakespearean insults in this play are just like so good. They're so funny. And like literally there are like pages of just like insults being traded back and forth, and it's awesome. Maybe if you've never read Shakespeare, don't start with this one, but if you're looking for a good history play to try, this is definitely very interesting. I gave it 5 stars. That was everything that I read in November. And then I have actually already started doing better in December, probably because classes ended and suddenly I had a little bit of spare time in the evenings. So I read this for school. This is The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. I'm not sure how I feel about Hardy. I really didn't like Hardy. And then I was like, okay, I kind of understand what he's doing, but I still don't like him. And then I read this one, and I was like, okay, I still don't like what he's doing, but he is a good writer. Like, I recognize why he's considered a great writer. This is about a man named Michael Henchard, and in the first, like, chapter or 2 of the book, Michael actually sells his wife, because he's in this, like, drunken moment of insanity. And she apparently is kind of a simple woman, so she's like, guess I'm gonna go live with this other guy now. And then Michael moves to a town called Casterbridge. In his defense, he does like wake up the next morning hungover and regretful and try to find his wife, but he can't. So he moves to this town called Casterbridge and slowly kind of establishes himself as a man of the town, and eventually he becomes a successful businessman and the mayor of Casterbridge, which is like an elected position that you hold for a year or something. And he's just kind of like at this pinnacle of being the mayor when his wife and her daughter Elizabeth Jane show up in town, and he's kind of like, and it's definitely a tragedy. Hardy wrote tragedies, so don't expect a totally happy ending, although I feel like this ending was a little bit more hopeful than some of the endings that I've read of Hardy's, so that was good. I feel like Hardy is just a little too relentless with his thematic elements. He kind of pounds them over your head and you're like, okay, I get it. I could only read this book in small chunks. Like after 50 or 60 pages, I was kind of like, didn't want to be in the headspace anymore. But at the same time, I usually enjoyed it up until I got to that place and I was like, ugh. So like I said, complicated feelings about Hardy about this book. His descriptions are amazing. They're beautiful. Casterbridge is a made-up town, but he bases it on Dorchester, which is where he lives, and so he knows the area very well. His landscape descriptions and everything are just beautiful. The story was very interesting, and so anyway, I give it 3 stars. I'm conflicted about Hardy. I need to read more of his work, I guess. We'll see. Maybe I'll become a fan someday. Then I finished The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock, which I had started in like October and then just sort of like didn't have time to return to, but I finished it. I actually finished it in like one swoop and it was lovely. I gave this 4 stars, or maybe like 3.5. I feel like there were a couple of uneven things, especially towards the end, but overall it was very enjoyable. This is a story about Mr. Hancock, a merchant who's one of his men, his captains, comes home from a voyage and is like, so I sold your ship and all the cargo, but I bought a mermaid. And Hancock is like, excuse me? But that event leads to a series of interactions and discoveries. It's also the story of a woman named Angelica Neal, who has made her living as a courtesan and has done very well for herself, except she's getting a little older. Her reputation isn't quite as high, and she's kind of like staring down the potential of sort of declining in society and not having what she needs. And the mermaid brings Mr. Hancock and Angelica together, and the story kind of goes from there. I really liked the writing. I thought it's kind of got this classic feel. Some of the like sentence structure is a little bit archaic. She uses some words in a more like old-fashioned sense, which threw me once or twice because I thought they were maybe mistakes, but once I realized she did it on purpose, then I didn't really notice, but it gives it this kind of old-fashioned feel, which I really appreciated. And overall, I enjoyed the story. It's definitely a character story and not a plot story, but it's thoughtful and just was an enjoyable thing to read. There's a slight element of magical realism sort of like tucked into the end, but generally it's just a nice, it's historical fiction. It's set in the late 1700s. As far as content goes, even though there are a couple of moments where we get some like scenes in the brothel that are a little bit explicit, but you're sort of meant to be a little bit taken aback by that and it's not like indulged. But other than that, it's just a good story. The last book I finished until yesterday was All Hallows Eve by Charles Williams. I started this on Halloween and again, didn't finish it until 6 weeks later. This was also a reread. This story is so weird. I have no idea how to describe it, but it's really brilliant. Charles Williams is a mid-19th century, mid-20th century British writer, and like all of his stories are really weird and hard to explain, and also like thinking very deeply about very big things like death and life, which is what this book thinks about. So it's about a woman named Lester who wakes up to realize that she's dead, and it's about her husband Richard and his friend Jonathan and Jonathan's girlfriend Betty, and together this foursome has to like fight to defeat the forces of evil, but that doesn't even like begin. It makes it sound like something it's not. It's definitely a more philosophical and thoughtful novel than like an action-adventure-y kind of one. Williams is exploring the boundary between life and death. What does it mean to die? Where do you go? He's thinking about salvation in very kind of like artistic and nuanced terms. He uses a lot of images of light and darkness, and I'm explaining it so badly, but if any of that sounds even sort of intriguing, I would encourage you to look it up and at least give it a try. His style is pretty consistent, so if you read the first chapter or something and are like, yeah, I kind of like that, keep reading. So those are the 7 books that I read in the last couple of weeks. I did actually finish a book yesterday, but I'm going to include that in my later wrap up because reasons. I have finished school for the semester, not forever, and so hopefully we'll have time to get some more videos out. I'll be doing the typical end of the year favorites and stuff, and maybe some other things, and then in January we're gonna be doing some new stuff. It's only been 2 days and I'm still on this weird like, what am I doing with my life stage that happens after every semester. So anyway, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments if you have read any of these books or if you would like me to better explain like All Hallows Eve. I'd love to hear from you about any of these, and thank you for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.